Hi everyone, welcome to this timeline documentary. Just before you watch it, I want to tell you about my new history channel. It's called History Hit. It's like the Netflix for history. It's got hundreds and hundreds of history documentaries on there and interviews with some of the world's best historians. We're adding new stuff all the time. For example, today I'm filming in this, one of the few remaining Lancaster bombers, for a show about the Dam Busters raid in 1943. If you want to know more about History Hit, follow the information just below this video, or search online for History Hit, and make sure you use the code TIMELINE to get a special introductory offer. Now enjoy this show.
The image of Adolf Hitler, the Führer, leader of the Nazi Party, casts a long shadow over the second half of the 20th century. A vision of incomprehensible evil that endures today. But behind this figure was an ordinary man, a master manipulator whose talent for public speaking and deep understanding of how to effectively use propaganda propelled him to ultimate power. In power, Hitler and the Nazi Party would build a propaganda and terror machine to persuade, coerce, and ultimately mobilize the population of Germany, defining the Nazi state through the notion of strength through unity. One people, one Reich, one Führer. Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January 1933 was celebrated that night by thousands of party members marching through the streets. An instant and overt display of Nazi Party power and influence. But in reality, he was the head of a coalition government with only two other members of the Nazi Party in his cabinet, Hermann Göring and the lawyer Wilhelm Frick. Hitler's first radio address as Chancellor on the 1st of February 1933 had to be approved by his cabinet and revealed the new role he would play, that of the moderate politician.
For a time after Hitler became Chancellor, he seemed to tone down his rhetoric a little. There was very much a sense of, okay, now we're in power, we'll do things more by the book.
In this speech, Hitler avoided anything that wouldn't appeal to a broad base, carefully chosen language conveying a positive outlook. Conspicuously absent from this speech was any sign of anti-Semitism. 2 days later, his speech to German Navy and Army commanders had a markedly different focus. In it, Hitler declared that only battle can save us, and everything else must be subordinated to this thought.
What Hitler did was really not present a consistent image, but a whole number of images, depending on the audience. There was a civic Hitler for the civic-minded. There was a revolutionary Hitler for the revolutionaries. There was a holy Hitler for the church, implied at least. So everyone could, in other words, read into Hitler what they wanted to see.
What followed was a year of considerable change, in which Hitler would establish absolute power through propaganda of persuasion and terror, compelling Germans to flee, comply, or convert to their cause, exerting control over every aspect of German culture and ideology. On the night of the 27th of February 1933, Hitler would be given his first major propaganda opportunity as Chancellor. When a fire broke out in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building, a young communist was arrested at the scene. The fire fed neatly into Hitler's narrative of anarchy, his promise to restore order, and the communist as enemy saboteur. Hitler capitalized on this by issuing a decree on the protection of the people and the state, suspending the right to assembly, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. It gave his regime the power to suppress publications and arrest political opponents without specific charges.
They made it clear that anybody who resisted them was going to have a nasty time. And that very quickly established their authority. Never underestimate weapons in the hands of the state that can be used to dominate a population and control a population.
Less than a month after the fire, Hitler stood under the looming presence of the swastika and presented his Enabling Act to Parliament. The bill would allow the Nazi Party to bypass the usual parliamentary due process, the country's constitution and the president, to pass their own unilateral laws. The Enabling Act was passed by the majority of the Reichstag, while armed members of the Nazi Party's own police and military forces, along with right-wing paramilitary group the Steel Helmets, stood at every door and surrounded the building. Hitler had finally gained legislative control of Germany, aided by the Nazi Party's intimidation tactics.
Basically, he took over the engines of power. So the police, the administration, everything which gives a state the power to exercise power. And he used it very ruthlessly.
Using the Enabling Act, Hitler would enact a range of legislation aimed at marginalizing, disempowering, and removing the Jewish population of Germany. On the street, his intimidation apparatus was trading off the persuasive power of fear. Groups like the SA, who had merged with the Steel Helmets in June 1933. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police headed by Hermann Göring, founded to monitor and quash political activity dangerous to the regime. And Hitler's personal bodyguard, the Schutzstaffel, or SS, which had grown by 1933 into an elite group of 52,000 men, led by Heinrich Himmler.
The role the SS, the SA and the Gestapo played as far as Hitler's attempt to create a kind of image of the Reich was of strength, but also of violence. And this element of violence, or the threat of violence, was very much a part of Hitler's politics.
The SA, SS, and Gestapo were an extension of the Nazi propaganda machine, agents of control and chaos, instigators of violence and protests in the streets, enforcers and security men marching in unison at rallies and demonstrations.
Das alles ist heil! Die große Zeit ist jetzt angebrochen. Deutschland ist nun erwacht. Da möchte ich euch jetzt danken, dass ihr nicht Banken geworden seid, dass ihr mich in der Zeit nicht verlassen habt. Denn nur euch allein ist das alles zuzuschreiben. Wenn ihr damals gegangen wärt, niemals wäre Deutschland mehr gerettet worden.
For weeks after Hitler was made Chancellor, the SA and Nazi Party members had been assaulting and imprisoning Jewish people, targeting their businesses for raids and violent attacks. On the 1st of April 1933, Goebbels formalized this into an organized campaign, orchestrating a boycott of Jewish businesses across Germany, using his resources as head of the new Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda.
Heute Morgen 10 Uhr hat der Boykott begonnen. Wird bis die Mitternachtsstunde fortgesetzt. Vollzieht sich mit einer schlagartigen Wucht, aber auch mit einer imponierenden Manneszucht und Disziplin.
Hitler realized that he had a real asset there, somebody who understood modern communication, who understood modern media, who was very much thoughtful in the way in which he was organizing things. So he gave him quite a lot of power in organizing the party propaganda machines.
In 1933, when the Nazis seized power, anti-Semitism became the doctrine of the state ideology, and the anti-Semitic regulations were immediately put into reality.
Crucially, the core element was the notion that whilst not all Jews represented some kind of criminal threat to Germany, nevertheless there was, in a sense, some abstract collective Jewish threat to Germany.
Some Germans didn't comply with the boycott, but it was considered a political act to walk into one of these shops. A stand many weren't willing to make.
So, in a sense, there was both genuine persuasion going on here about this notion that the Jews were a genuine threat. At the same time, there were huge incentives to go along and support this kind of propaganda, whether one really believed in it or not, because it was the propaganda that showed what the regime believed and how the regime was operating.
While it was only one day, it served its purpose as a statement of propaganda and policy. Fear in the Nazi regime became one of their most potent persuaders.
I sometimes think that fear is underestimated, not in a direct sense. I mean, for most people, if you kept your nose clean, then you could get on with your life. You'd have to make the regular gestures, you'd have to raise your arm, when you went into state offices and that kind of thing. Otherwise, the regime, on the whole, wouldn't bother you. But at the back of your mind, it seems to me, if I'd been living in that regime, I would have been aware that if I did step out of line, then nasty things could happen to me.
The party perpetrated the idea that if you stepped out of line, if you were seen to not be a good German, they would come for you. And come they did. The first concentration camp, near the town of Dachau, was opened on the 22nd of March, 1933.
The first inmates of the camps, which opened as soon as he took power, were communists, they were liberals, they were conservatives. So he literally defanged the opposition by physically eliminating it. Many, of course, fled into exile. They were the clever ones.
By July of that year, Dachau and other hastily established camps around Germany held almost 27,000 people. Many had been denounced by friends and neighbors. None had been indicted or convicted at trial. At odds with this reality was the pervasive myth of the benevolent concentration camp rehabilitating its inhabitants. A stark example of how the Nazi Party used propaganda to make their policies palatable, masking their true intent behind a facade of righteousness. Hitler was also fixated on unifying Nazi ideology and German identity, using carefully managed plebiscites to legitimize his policies and actions.
Now, these figures, of course, can be challenged, but insofar as they are a measurement of public opinion, they are worth considering.
Manipulating public perception, using one of the pillars of democracy as a propaganda tool. The first of these referendums would seek endorsement for Hitler's foreign policy. The referendum asked Germans to literally internalize Hitler's rhetoric. Do you, German man and German woman, approve of this policy of your Reich government? And are you prepared to declare it to be your own view and your own will to solemnly profess your belief in it?
Ich hoffe, dass heute alle mit Ja stimmen und die nationalsozialistische Bewegung wählen. Es gibt keine andere Entscheidung mehr.
Of the 45 million Germans who voted, over 95% said yes. The question and the response were both products of a state where every poster, picture, and slogan reminded you to conform to the notion of one people, one Reich, one Führer.
There is one particular poster which I think encapsulates Adolf Hitler's imagery, and that's a famous poster in which he's painted. It's not a photograph, he's standing there in full colour in his brown uniform, and the slogan is one Volk, one Reich, one Führer, one people, one empire, one leader. And nowhere on that is mentioned the government or the party. It's linking those three key elements of Nazi propaganda: the people, the Volk, the Reich, the empire, and the Führer, the leader. It's a remarkable example of how the Führer is portrayed as almost godlike, bestriding Germany beyond the concerns of day-to-day bureaucracy.
Behind the propaganda, the Nazi Party were taking steps to align the realities of government with this vision. A revolution of power that involved intimidating, coercing, and otherwise persuading Germany's remaining political parties to disband. Within a matter of months, Hitler and the Nazi Party had completely dismantled Germany's democratic multi-party system. While Hitler's power and influence grew, so too did the Nazi Party's own paramilitary forces. But Germany's army viewed this privately controlled force, that by mid-1934 was 4 times their size, with unease. Army leadership saw the SA as a potential barrier to their own expansion.
Hitler didn't want that at all. He wanted it to be subordinate to the party, simply a strong arm sort of movement for the party to basically beat up opponents and march through towns and generally give an impression, an image of strength and determination, and action and so on. But he didn't want them being military.
It was a problem Hitler would have to resolve. On the 29th of May, 1934, he ordered the SA to cease military exercises. This was followed over June and July by a violent bloodletting of the SA's command, including Ernst Röhm, one of Hitler's closest allies since the early years of the party.
Röhm was very useful as a bully boy, a tough guy on the street, led the SA. But his belief was you wanted violent revolution, you seize power, you repeat the coup. And for Hitler, this was dated, this was out of fashion, it wouldn't work.
Largely orchestrated by Hitler, Goering, and Himmler, this period would later be known as the Night of the Long Knives. At least 70 party members were killed, but the figure was possibly as high as 400.
So after that, the SA was totally tamed and became really unimportant. It was replaced by the SS. They took over as the main sort of enforcers, the main terror organization of the regime from then onwards.
Presented to the public as the quelling of a threatened revolt, it was widely supported as restoring order to an organization viewed as difficult to manage.
What the depiction of an event does is give us the regime's view of it. It doesn't tell us the truth of the event. The depiction of the event can be changed by the alchemy of propaganda into something entirely different. The interesting thing is that the German people were not prepared to interrogate these very pastiche justifications. They looked the other way. They just accepted this fait accompli of something absolutely appallingly degenerate, the random murder of a lot of key figures in their political civilization.
Hitler capitalized on the narrative value of these events, declaring certain death for anyone who threatened the regime. Himmler benefited greatly from the coup. Already in control of the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, his inimitable SS force was made its own independent organization, making him second only to Hitler. Hitler's path to absolute power was completely cleared when, on the 2nd of August 1934, President Hindenburg died. 2 weeks later, Hitler held another referendum to gain support for combining his position as Chancellor of Germany with the now vacated role of President. While turnout was low, almost 90% of voters agreed with his proposal. Hitler was now head of state and head of the government. In response, the Nazi Party generated a cacophony of celebratory propaganda in images, radio, and print. Posters were distributed with such slogans as, "Yes, Führer, we will follow you." The Nazi propaganda narrative of one people, one Reich, one Führer was finally reflected in Germany's power structure. While Hitler was consolidating power, Goebbels was using his propaganda ministry to gain control of German art, culture, and education.
The Nazis' control of art and culture was a fundamental part of their propaganda. Art has traditionally been a way in which dissent is expressed, whether that's in the form of poetry, music, or indeed painting. But the Nazis were very quick to take full control of art, abolishing some or banning it on the grounds that it was decadent.
On the 12th of April, school organizations declared a period of cleansing that would end in a ritualized burning of blacklisted books on the 10th of May, 1933. Bonfires were set up in Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt, Dresden, and Breslau, and lines of torch-wielding students and SA members flung books onto the pyre. Goebbels and other key party members watched as these un-German works were burned in front of the Berlin Opera House. He declared to the crowd that, out of these ashes, the phoenix of a new age will rise. These ritualized ceremonies, held by torchlight, with singing, chanting, and oaths made, were broadcast by radio around Germany. The Nazis targeted education as an important facet of their propaganda machine.
Education was used to shape the nation and what the Nazis called the national community. So it was about fostering a sense of creation and belonging to the nation. And this took the form of all kinds of different changes to the curriculum and to school textbooks.
The National Socialist idea of the national community was in fact an exclusive club meant only for strong, healthy Aryans. Educational content produced by the Nazis provided a framework for justifying this. Textbooks began to incorporate anti-Semitism disguised as objective biological or anthropological fact.
One of them was called the poisonous mushroom. And again, it was just about really trying to show a whole gamut of allegations. So the Jew as a communist, the Jew as a financier.
Classrooms became an important frontier for perpetuating Nazi ideology, disguised as education.
The way that German was taught was also important too, so that there was a focus in education, in German lessons, not just on the language, but on the literature as well, and on folk tales and German myths and legends, as well as on components of the blood and soil ideology that meant that people were bound up to the nation and to the land.
Germany's youth were considered incredibly important to the National Socialist movement. Their exposure to Nazi propaganda took place in and out of the classroom.
The Nazis had a concept of total education, and this meant a combination of formal education in the school system, complemented by informal socialization, we could say.
Membership in the Hitler Youth grew from around 100,000 members in 1932 to over 7 million in 1939. Groups like Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls indoctrinated children through exposure to Nazi publications and participation in Nazi party rallies, summer camps, and almost militarized games.
It was the idea of each German girl or boy playing their part in the nation, almost as building blocks to create an organic whole. And this organic whole would be the foundation of the future. So the youth were absolutely essential to everything that the Nazis did.
In late 1933, Goebbels expanded his control over German culture by establishing the Reich Culture Chamber, or RKK, through his propaganda ministry. The RKK was made up of 7 chambers: literature, film, theater, music, visual arts, press, and radio.
you can see this is a pretty ambitious program. Goebbels again brought his characteristic energy to this and had, the help of thousands of employees and all manner of resources.
In an attempt to control public discourse, Goebbels mandated that every artist or journalist who wanted to practice in Germany had to apply to the RKK. Goebbels was particularly aware of the power of mass media. He required all films produced in Germany to be reviewed and approved by the RKK. And he identified radio as the most modern and important instrument of mass influence that exists anywhere. By 1932, there was a radio in 1 out of every 4 German homes. Goebbels sought to improve on that figure.
The Nazi regime introduced a new radio set called the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver. And this was a very cheap radio set which practically anyone could afford. So what this meant was that when there were Nazi speeches or Hitler speaking or one of the other key leaders or different messages that they wanted to get across, they could use the radio.
When Goebbels took control of the Reich Broadcasting Company, it gave the Nazi Party unfettered access to the airwaves for blatant propaganda programming. Goebbels also targeted German publishing, taking control of the assets of rival political parties and Jewish companies. Those still allowed to practice chose self-censorship, following daily directives from the press chamber.
Goebbels, though, was very careful not to drum propaganda, and ideology into people. He very quickly told the press that they shouldn't bore people. He very quickly realized that what people wanted was basically what they had before, and with a sort of judicious doses of propaganda, but carefully calibrated so that it didn't appear like propaganda.
If you disobeyed directives, at best you would be fired. At worst, sent to a concentration camp. In response to the Nazis' tightening grip, hundreds of scientists and artists fled Germany. Figures who had greeted the rise of National Socialism with deep hostility and concern. Over the course of the 1930s, 300,000 Germans would leave their country. Among them was Albert Einstein. The RKK sought to define what works expressed the narrow Nazi view of German culture. In 1937, they used their control over museums and theater to run an anti-Semitic exhibition called The Eternal Jew in Munich, supported by a similarly themed play run by the Bavarian State Theater.
They wanted a very wholesome German art that emphasized myths like blood and soil, people's connection to, literally to the German earth and to their German heredity as well, and how that could be portrayed in art.
Over 400,000 people attended the exhibition, but even more attended their exhibition of degenerate art that targeted anything abstract or interpretive, which was visited by 2 million people. Turnout that reinforced the reach that art could have.
The other thing that's quite important is the way that Hitler was portrayed in art as well. The artistic portraits that were made of him were also quite evocative, whether as the military leader in his uniform or as a kind of Teutonic messianic leader that was going to lead the nation to greatness again.
Hitler and his supporters used every aspect of their control over German culture to perpetuate his cult of personality.
The way Hitler created and staged and managed his own image is remarkably instructive into how the Nazi Party actually saw Hitler too. Hitler actually separated himself in some ways from the Nazi Party itself. He was portrayed almost as a king-like figure, beyond the minor concerns of party squabbles, unimpeachable, unapproachable, and yet also the embodiment of German strength.
The pinnacle of Nazi propaganda depicting Hitler the Messianic leader was the 1935 film Triumph des Willens, or Triumph of the Will. Filmed as a documentary of the 1934 Reich Party Congress at Nuremberg.
So sei dann unser Gelöbnis an diesem Abend, in jeder Stunde, an jedem Tag, nur zu denken an Deutschland, an Volk und an Reich, an unsere deutsche Nation. Unser deutsches Volk siegt heil! Siegt heil! Siegt heil!
It really represents the kind of edited quintessence of the party, its image of itself, its projection to the world of what it was. It is truly disturbing because it's a kind of militarized ballet in which it elevates certain human virtues like discipline, and others it entirely not merely neglects but throws into the rubbish bag. You have to have a pointy blonde Aryan face and be athletic and disciplined and obey.
Disciplined forces stand to attention in rows, cheering masses with arms raised as they hail in unison, children with blonde curls greeted by their Führer. The film also showcases the neoclassical architecture of the rally grounds, designed in part by Albert Speer.
Architecture that Speer built for it is in itself a kind of filmic architecture. So it's that kind of austere neoclassicism that we associate with Nazi and fascist official architecture today, but it's also something that's specifically designed to look good for camera. It's almost like a kind of grand Hollywood stage set, enhanced at the time by special lighting shows.
Triumph of the Will, like the Wagnerian operas Hitler was known to love, used staging, lighting, and music to amplify the emotional power of the story. Seeking to create and perpetuate an enduring mythology of the Third Reich.
The Nazis were always conscious of propaganda not just affecting people in the moment, but also about how it would affect the way future generations would remember and recall their achievements. Because they're not just adopting a neoclassical style for all official buildings of state, but they're also anticipating what these buildings would look like in the future, including in the very distant future. So what are they going to look like in 1,000 or 2,000 years' time? Will these buildings still be awe-inspiring once they're in a ruined state as the Acropolis is today?
The rally itself was an expression of Nazi symbols: power, unity, cohesion, an artifact of party propaganda. Titled Reich Party Rally of Unity and Strength, the 1934 rally was the first since Hitler had successfully combined the position of Chancellor and President, taking comprehensive control of Germany. And only months after the Night of the Long Knives had resulted in a bloody upheaval of SA leadership. The rally and the film were also a work of propaganda turned inwards, aimed at the party itself, calling on all to come together.
Das deutsche Volk ist glücklich in dem Bewusstsein, dass die ewige Flucht der Erscheinungen nunmehr endgültig abgelöst wurde von einem ruhenden Volk, der sich als Träger seines besten Blutes fühlen und dieses wissend zur Führung der Nation erhoben hat und entschlossen ist, diese Führung zu behalten, wahrzunehmen und nicht mehr abzugeben.
It's the moment that Hitler becomes a god.
Das kann nicht anders sein.
He is now no longer immortal, and this is what Triumph of the Will is really doing. It's about the supremacy, the superheroism of Hitler, but also his superhumanity. He's no longer human.
Long after Hitler had gained power, he continued to hold these rallies, aimed at mobilizing the German people and generating a kind of self-actualized acclaim for the Nazi Party, displaying their own power and the rapturous celebrations of rally participants. In 1935, the rally became the site for the passing of Hitler's Nuremberg laws. laws that severely limited civil rights of anyone the Nazis deemed undesirable, particularly for Jews in Germany.
The Nuremberg laws paved the way for all subsequent laws and regulation, and there were more than 1,000 anti-Jewish laws. They all went back to the Nuremberg laws, and this legal process, more or less, also paved the way for the final aim of the Nazis to exterminate the Jews.
The Nuremberg laws only heightened the importance of the rally in the Nazi state. They would be held each year at Nuremberg until the outbreak of World War II. Each rally promoted through posters filled with Nazi iconography. The Nuremberg rallies were only one of many methods the party had for generating symbols of Nazi power and German strength rebuilt. One of the Nazis' greatest propaganda successes was the 1936 Berlin Olympics.
The 1936 Olympics is dripping with Nazi propaganda. This is, in some ways, the opportunity for Nazi Germany to show its public face to the world. There'll be cameras there, there'll be reporters there. For the first time since the Nazis took over the government in 1933, there's large-scale foreign visit to Germany, and they want to portray Nazi Germany in the very best possible light.
This was a chance to present a sanitized version of Nazi Germany to the international community.
Well, it had been managed at every level. Gypsies had been removed to concentration camps. Most of the signs saying Jews forbidden were removed. It was a fantasy of Germany to present to the world.
Hitler funneled massive resources into realizing this potential, spending more to host the Games than any previous Olympiad. This included a new stadium, designed by Albert Speer in the neoclassical style that Hitler favored for Nazi architecture, built to hold 250,000 spectators. The Berlin Games were also treated as an opportunity for the Nazis to showcase the strength and efficiency of this new Germany, rebuilt from the ruins of World War I and the Great Depression.
He's not merely satisfied with portraying the image of Berlin as a fabulous, modern and vibrant city. He also wants to show that the German race is on a higher level than those of others who are visiting the place. And it's actually a very effective propaganda tool.
A narrative that was disrupted by the success of African-American athletes like long jumper Jesse Owens, who beat German Lutz Long. Over 45 countries, including the US, Great Britain, and France, participated in the Games, a fact that acknowledged the legitimacy of Hitler's regime, both within Germany and overseas.
Remember that this happens after the Nuremberg laws, after the opening of the concentration camps. There's an awful lot leaking out to the international community about how truly wicked Nazi Germany was. But Germany produced this brilliant PR campaign. It really was effectively bribing journalists with marvelous facilities. Nothing like it had ever been done before in all of history.
The Olympics in Berlin became another opportunity to generate propaganda artifacts and harness new technologies. The Berlin Olympics were the first sporting event to ever be broadcast live on television. Another display of the technical proficiency and superiority of Nazi Germany. Nazi propaganda often reflected Hitler's focus on the idea of building a modern, innovative Germany. Soon after becoming Chancellor, Hitler took control of the fledgling Autobahn program, a plan to build a network of intercity freeways across Germany. Breaking ground on construction became another ritual. Columns of marching figures with shovels replacing flags or weapons.
So there's the sort of physical side of the propaganda. So the Autobahn and the motorways talked about putting the people back to work and being very important in turning around the economy entirely.
Hitler dedicated the new roads to the German people, and specifically the German worker.
Präsident, gehen Sie jetzt zur Arbeit. Und ehe 6 Jahre vergangen, soll ein Riesenberg zeugen von unserem Willen, unserem Fleiß, unserer Fähigkeit und unserer Entschlusskraft. Deutsche Arbeiter, an das Werk!
Commencement of works of building a new Germany in the Nazi image became another facet of the propaganda machine. 2 years later, Hitler was starting to open sections of the network to great adulation.
So what these successes were doing was distracting from the apparatus of terror and use of force and intimidation. It wasn't completely out of view, but people weren't focusing on it in those first 5 or so years of the Third Reich.
Once Hitler was in power, for a time it seemed as if he was a very effective leader. He brought back a lot of public works. German economy, at least for a time, looked like it was booming. But it was a paper tiger. It was an economy that was only going to operate if they could bring in enough raw materials from abroad. And they could only do that if they could get territorial conquests either by negotiation or by war.
Hitler converted this need to expand into neighboring territories into a new propaganda narrative, the urgent need for Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people.
The idea of Lebensraum was very much the hidden agenda. Mein Kampf has a lot to say about it, and it had always been the big theme in Nazi policy was to create an empire to the east where you'd settle German NCOs as farmers, and you'd have a servile, semi-slave serf population carved out of the Slavic peoples.
The way to achieve it for Hitler was through military power and the rearmament of Germany as a priority. Rearmament was sold as a way to return Germany to its former glory. It was also a valuable propaganda tool, a new industrial program that would be a way to get Germans back to work. This growing military power was paraded at party rallies and in marches through the streets. Symbols of new German strength and unity. But Lebensraum wouldn't be achieved through military strength alone. Each new territorial gain was lubricated by the Nazi propaganda machine. Their first test came in 1935, when the population of the Saarland in southwest Germany were given the chance to vote for their fate. Stay under League of Nations control, or become part of either France or Germany. The Nazi propaganda ministry ran an intensive campaign, handing out cheap radios to make sure their message was heard in as many homes as possible, using those radios to spread false claims about their opponents, and calling for the Saar to return home to the Reich. Over 90% of the population voted to return to Germany, to join the Third Reich. In March 1936, Hitler flaunted the Treaty of Versailles by moving 30,000 troops into the Rhineland. A move justified through a mass media campaign that suggested Germany was under threat from France and Russia. When his actions drew little reaction from the international community, Hitler would tell a crowd in Munich, "I go with the certainty of a sleepwalker along the path laid out for me by Providence." Bolstered by these successes, Hitler continued his program of expansion. His first major target of 1938 was Austria. The incorporation, or Anschluss, of Austria into the Reich was an orchestrated affair. Hitler's chance to demonstrate the new military power of his regime and a prime propaganda opportunity.
The Anschluss, the return of Austria to the great German fatherland, was a natural move for him because he was Austrian. And as he said after he'd taken over, after the Anschluss, your son has returned to his homeland.
Hitler used Nazi symbols and military strength to reinforce the idea that Austria was returning to the fold. The swastika flag hung on the facade of Austrian buildings. Hitler surveyed German tanks as they rolled through the streets of Vienna. Cheering crowds lined streets, there to welcome the Nazi takeover.
Übrigens bin ich glücklich, damit nunmehr zu Vollstrecker des höchsten geschichtlichen Auftrags geworden zu sein. Welch stolzere Befriedigung kann es auf dieser Welt für einen Mann geben, als die Menschen der eigenen Heimat in die größere Volksgemeinschaft geführt zu haben?
Well, the Anschluss was another of those masterpieces of propaganda that the Austrian people were univocal in wanting Hitler.
The regime was quick to spread Nazi-controlled information, approved German newspapers replacing Austrian publications on newsstands. Hitler would also personally brief 400 media representatives on how the Anschluss should be presented. Then, in October 1938, Hitler took another step towards expanding his new empire when he successfully negotiated to bring the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia into Greater Germany.
I think where it changes is Czechoslovakia. Because this is something you can justify with a good narrative built around some facts and ideas. So yes, what do you have in Czechoslovakia? You have a new state that was carved at the end of the First World War, but you've got a little bit of a problem because you've got quite a sizable German minority in that area called Sudetenland. So of course that becomes part of an agenda of irredentism, of trying to redeem certain territories in Germany.
At the time, almost 1 in 4 people living in Czechoslovakia were German, yet only 8% of Czech broadcasts were in German. So instead, they were tuning in to Nazi broadcasts, fed on a diet of Nazi propaganda.
Hitler went beyond the standard issues associated with Versailles revisionism. Rhineland, Austria, Tsar, reparations, remilitarization, and so on. Into, I would like to break up the boundaries of another state and annex bits of territory that had been awarded to another state against their will, was a change of tack completely. He was stepping up the gears quite substantially.
Many would welcome their return to the German fold, not the Jewish population. If they had any doubt about the terrible threat they faced, the events over one night in November 1938 would cast those aside. In response to the murder of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Jew, Goebbels made an impassioned speech calling for retaliation. It was the embodiment of Nazi rhetoric, that all Jews were responsible for the sin of one. On the night of the 8th of November, 7,500 Jewish businesses across Germany and Austria were damaged or destroyed.
For Jews, it has a deep impact on their consciousness and their memory, because most Jews realized, experiencing the burning of their synagogues, of their prayer houses, the destruction of their homes, the arrest of 30,000 males, the murder of Jews, and the terror in streets. It symbolized the end of a German-Jewish relationship.
The whole event was framed and contextualized by Nazi propaganda, dictating how the press could cover what had happened. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, named in reference to the broken shop windows, led to a spike not only in Jewish emigration, but also suicides. The world was shocked by this fresh brutality enacted against Jews by the Nazi regime.
But you see, that was part of the plan, to actually inject fear into the global community. And the brutality was also part of the propaganda because they wanted people to fear them. They wanted people to be terrified of them, which they were.
Despite the horrors of events like Kristallnacht, the international community remained unwilling to stop Hitler. No one wanted another war. As the negotiations to hand over the Sudetenland had shown, the Allies were willing to put up with a lot to avoid one. And so, 1939 began with Time magazine naming Hitler 1938's Man of the Year. his influence on world events considered more significant, more comprehensive than any other figure. German conquests of other nations had so far been relatively bloodless, and the general sentiment among the German people remained opposed to the idea of all-out war. Hitler was faced with a propaganda challenge.
There's no question that Germans didn't want war. What they wanted was, so to speak, what Hitler gained. And I think they'd have been very happy if he'd stopped, the Sudetenland and left it at that.
Despite everything that had happened since he came to power, Hitler still needed to mobilize the nation, to make them feel like there was no choice but to fight. Hitler needed the propaganda ministry to introduce a new angle.
Up until 1938, he had spoken of peace a lot, his speeches. But after Munich, he hauled the various editors of newspapers in to a big meeting and said, right, from now onwards we've been talking peace, now we've got to prepare the German population for war.
Within this narrative, Hitler was positioned as wanting nothing but peace, a notion he would play to repeatedly each time he made a show of sincere peace offerings. But on the 1st of September 1939, Hitler would confirm once again that the very opposite was true, marching Germany towards the goal he had set out to achieve when he came to power. The ultimate Nazi narrative device: conquest through military supremacy.